So, welcome to my show, Dr. Robert Malone. It's so great to have you here.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today and with your audience. Niles, thank you, and thank you for your leadership.
Yeah. Well, I think this is your first interview for a Swedish audience, I think. Well, this is done in English, of course, but my audience is mainly Swedish. I previously interviewed Sinatra Gupta, Martin Kulldorff, and others in English, but I think this will be very special talk to you, and I have so many questions for you, maybe too many. Some of my friends have tried to add and sneak in questions too.
Okay.
Uh, but first of all, congratulations to your great book. You see the cover there behind you, lies that my government told me, and better future coming. Especially like the second part of that title. It's topping now on Amazon and on new releases. It's topping also on the section for politics and facts, I think it's called. That must be quite fulfilling for you.
I don't know. It's been a long 3 years of just trying to share information, help people to understand what they've been subjected to. And it's been a year in preparation for this book. We've basically used Substack to serialize it, and
Hmm.
we continue to write daily on Substack. Actually, when we turned the book into Skyhorse, it was about twice as long,
Yeah.
and the
Not
editor in
right now.
chief,
It's about 900 pages, right?
it's about 450 printed. Um,
Okay.
so you're probably referring to the ebook,
Yeah, the
and
ebook. Yeah, that's one.
yeah, it was even quite a bit longer, and Skyhorse did a heroic job cutting it down, but unfortunately, a number of chapters from friends and colleagues hit the cutting room floor. So now we have to do the next book. It keeps going, but thanks for the congratulations. It's good to have it out there. It answers a lot of questions and concerns that people have had, and hopefully also helps people to take their own journeys in trying to comprehend what we've been subjected to. That's the purpose of the book.
Please check out the Stockholm conference with Dr. Robert Malone as one of the speakers.
Is the book is absolutely not, we didn't create this to make money or to get approbation. I'm grateful for that, but that this was not about us. This was about trying to help people to 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 understand what has transpired over the last 3 years, and as a way to help, particularly those that aren't um, uh, in the choir, that aren't awake yet, those that might become awake
Right.
if they had access to the information. That's I'm writing. Jill and I wrote this uh, with with the intention of trying to reach the persuadable middle, not to provide a cheering section and self-congratulation for the people that are already alert to what's happened. So
Right.
that's the intention.
Well,
And some may criticize that it's not sufficiently radical enough, uh, but uh, but that's why the book is written the way it is.
yeah, and you've had also, I mean, the first chapters you have help from great persons that like Professor Desmet from Ghent
Again,
University, yeah,
right?
and
Yeah.
many
So the
others who
the
add to your story, right? And I
yeah.
think
So
that's
the front section was intended to help people to vicariously experience what it's been like on the front lines,
mhm,
so that they can appreciate, because folks that are just living their lives, they don't they I hope they haven't experienced it in the same way that people like Meryl Nass, Pierre Corey, Paul Merrick, and myself have, for example.
yeah,
It hasn't been very pleasant being subjected to the kind of pressure that we've had for speaking what we believe to be truth and alerting people about risks. And I think for the average person, for somebody who hasn't, I don't want nobody's average. I don't want to put it that way. For somebody who hasn't um, been out front and subjected themselves to this, it's kind of a little bit hard to appreciate what it's been like. And so that's what that front section is intended to do, is with many different voices provide testimony
Right.
of what it's been like.
Yeah, I mean, I see you. I mean, I feel almost like I know you because I have followed you
Thank you.
so closely for at least a year, and since you were on the Joe Rogan show and a bit before that. But I myself is a trained. I mean, have a PhD in microbiology, but I changed courses and now I'm working as a psychiatrist in Malmö, Sweden, and I mean it has been so important, I think, for like junior physicians like myself to see people like you and many others in the USA especially, but also now from England and from other countries, senior doctors with, I mean, uh, so many publications, so much merit, so much background in medicine, in research, and that you come out and speak up against injustices, against vaccine mandates, against this whole horrific show that we have been that has played up before our eyes. And it's been very helpful to us. And
Well,
just
thank
want to
you.
I just want to thank you for that. And you have a global outreach, and I can't. It's hard to underestimate it's hard to overestimate the impact that you and many of your colleagues have had.
Well, thank you. I've one of the, this is not, as I said, not to whine, but this has not been an easy road. Uh, um, the feedback from colleagues in the uh, um, medical care providing space, uh, along the lines of, I've heard it repeatedly. I felt so alone until I heard your voice. Or another one that I hear is, I thought I was crazy until I
Yeah.
heard you speak. Uh, that these are all symptoms of this profound propaganda campaign that has been
Mhm.
deployed globally, uh, including all the gaslighting and censorship and everything else. And it's it's fascinating to me intellectually to hear and see, and it's also very kind and reassuring and helpful to me to get the feedback that I'm helping people. I'm helping my
Right.
colleagues. I'm helping physicians. I'm helping patients. Um, that that
What
kind of
have
makes
you
it
had? Yeah.
possible.
What have you personally? I mean, for people who haven't read your book, who haven't followed this, um what have you personally had to sacrifice, and what kind of pushbacks have you gotten from, let's say, from colleagues, from government bodies, and from media and state licensing bodies that have the power to, question a physician's, a doctor's ability to practice medicine, for example? Like, can you give us some examples of what it has been for you?
Well, my wife and I have developed a consulting practice, a quiet consulting practice in this space of grants, proposals, clinical research, in particularly increasingly in international clinical research over 30 years. This is why we both completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard and in global clinical research and bioethics, et cetera. And we've completely destroyed our practice by speaking out. Um, uh, I did have a physician in Maui that has become obsessed about me, uh, try to take my license right around last Christmas, so a little over a year ago, and filed a complaint to the effect that I was responsible for millions and millions of deaths by discouraging people from taking the jab, and that I had misrepresented my CV in various ways, all of which were false. There is a cohort, for some reason, when you start getting to be higher profile on social media or otherwise, it attracts a cadre of haters. As a practicing psychiatrist or psychologist, I
Yeah.
suspect you understand this better than I do. It's there is this tendency for some to become very obsessed with public figures, and it can manifest as stalking, and certainly manifests as internet stalking. There's also a business model that is employed, and I'm not going to name names. I think it's counterproductive, but it just amplifies. It's the same as why you don't speak about the name of a shooter in a mass shooting event. Is it only gives them more fame and the things they're seeking. But there is a business model of stoking rage or outrage, and it's very effective from the level of CNN all the way down to this most obscure podcaster, by making outrageous statements, using fear porn tactics, etc. You can generate clicks and followers, and that translates into money and an opportunity to sell air filters that will take spike out of the air or whatever
Right.
the thing you want to sell. So
One of the
there's
things, I mean, one of the things that you, and unfortunately also, I'm not high profile in any way, but that I also been accused of is to be an anti-vaxxer, that you're against vaccines in general because you have chosen to speak out about some of the
yeah
questions regarding the
yes
mRNA vaccines. And now,
so
for
yeah
those who
so
don't, yeah,
that's a strategy. That is a propaganda strategy. That's gaslighting.
right,
And it's one of many. The terms misinformation and disinformation that have been weaponized against all of us, and this has been intentional. The World Health Organization has been involved in it. The Trusted News Initiative has been involved in it. These terms, as well as accusing somebody of being a deep state or controlled opposition, all of those terms basically are an accusation of fraud.
right,
They are claiming, and when they say you're an anti-vaxxer, they're essentially asserting that you're not objective in evaluating data and
right,
making rational decisions in advising your patients, particularly if you're a physician. And these are all this cluster of terms are ways of accusing someone of fraud, of misrepresenting who they are, misrepresenting the truth, uh, not being objective, and fraud is a form accusation of fraud that is not substantiated,
right.
is a form of defamation, and that I think we need to be very clear in calling that out. And in my opinion, and this is something that is considered controversial for some strange reason, people that traffic in defamation, no matter where they are in the political spectrum, should be reprimanded. They should be called out. It should not be acceptable practice, whether you're the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic Monthly, Rolling
Right.
Stone, Der Spiegel, or the Guardian, or the Daily Mail, or anything, all the way down to the smallest podcaster. That's just not acceptable.
Right. Because I mean, my research was about vaccines. I about the pneumococcal vaccine. And as a physician, I mean, you're very pro effective, secure drugs, very pro life-saving vaccines, right? But then all of a sudden you see that these new mRNA and DNA vaccines are being rolled out at a warp speed, which would usually take years and years of research and clinical trials, and all of a sudden it's all done in like 6 months or 8 months or whatever. And when you speak out against that, you said, "Hello, like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Is this really safe to do this? Shouldn't these trials go on for at least a couple of years to see if there are any unwanted side effects or anything like that?" But then you reach this wall of propaganda that is just anything that's questioning, is called anti-vaxxer, is called a lunatic, basically. And
Yeah.
for people who don't know who you are, could you just, I mean, a lot of people do, but I think also some of my listeners don't. So please, I mean, you are widely recognized as the or one of the inventors of the technology behind the current COVID-19 vaccines.
So I'm a U.S. licensed physician, licensed to practice in the state of Maryland. I'm
Mm.
also a scientist. I was pursuing my PhD and completed my qualifying exams and my oral exams at UC San Diego and the Salk Institute when I had the series of discoveries that resulted in my filing patent disclosure for the use of mRNA as a drug. So these were enabling technologies, findings, and protocols that hadn't been ever done before. Large-scale mRNA manufacture and the technology to enable it to be readily delivered, and the insight that I was working in a gene therapy lab, the laboratory of Dr. Inder Verma in the molecular biology and virology labs at the Salk Institute at a time when there was about half a dozen Nobel laureates at the Salk.
Yeah.
And Jonas Salk was still alive in there. So a real intellectual hothouse environment. And I had these discoveries, and then that set off a firestorm of, let's just say gently, avaricious behavior from other faculty members, my mentor, et cetera. Everybody saw that there was potential money to be made and people could get rich on this. And I ended up with caught in the crossfire between the university and the Salk Institute over who was going to have patent rights and patent authorship and all that kind of stuff. And I ended up with a nervous breakdown and a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So this is
Wow.
at age 29. But since then, I have completed my MD, been licensed, did an internship in pathology, taught pathology for many years at the faculty assistant and associate level professor at various medical schools, UC Davis School of Medicine, University of Maryland, Baltimore School of Medicine, and the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. I've started companies. I've worked for a Bill and Melinda Gates funded company called Eris Global TB Vaccine Foundation. I've worked closely with the U.S. government, particularly after the anthrax attacks in 2001,
Right.
and have captured for my clients something crazy numbers, well over $10 billion in federal contracts. I, up until this, frequently was called to chair study sections for very large contracts for biodefense and vaccines development. I have 15 plus patents, over 100 papers, over 13,000 academic citations for my work. The original patents, I think there's about 9 of them that cover mRNA and DNA vaccine technology, and also mucosal vaccines,
Right.
polynucleotide vaccines. I received for most of those patents $1 in compensation for the rights, so I absolutely did not get rich on them. I never received any patent royalties. Over $1 billion were spent before the patents expired in trying to develop products by Merck and by Vical that failed. And since 9/11, I pivoted from being a discovery research academic that was an academic entrepreneur to focusing on what we call advanced development. So that's clinical research, regulatory affairs, project management, all the things that go into the latter stage of developing products, both drugs and biologics. I have extensive experience in drug repurposing,
Right.
and have published about that previously. So I'm one of the oddballs that spans the whole gamut
Right.
from discovery research all the way through licensure, and can readily work in all those different cultures. And I'm a pretty good writer too, which is part of why I was able to be so successful in proposal development. So there's a
Right.
brief overview. Throughout all of this, I've worked very closely with my wife of over 44 years, Dr. Jill Glasspool Malone. We're both trained in bioethics, among other things. And her PhD is in biotechnology and public policy. So we've been a team all the way through this, and we were a team in writing the book.
Right. And now you live and work at a ranch in Virginia.
Well, yeah. So I was a farmer and a carpenter before I went back to school. Uh,
Hmm.
so I have a tractor. It's fully paid off. We just had delivered a very nice Lusitano foal on Christmas night. Uh, we breed the Lusitano horse, the Portuguese horse, and we've been breeding horses, Jill and I, for I don't know, must be 20 years now. And this foal that was just born is a fourth generation for us, Lusitano.
Right.
So we're very proud of that. So yeah, we live close to the ground. We're, if you know the metaphor of physicals versus virtuals versus machines and their overlords, I very much live in the physical space as well as in the virtual space.
Right. Well, yeah, that's an impressive CV. I don't know how anybody would want to attack it, because you've served your country and humankind in the best of ways, and using your intelligence in the best of ways. And how do you? I mean, how did you? Because I know you had the jab. You were in injected twice with Moderna, right? Is that right?
Correct. And I had life-threatening adverse events on jab 2.
Oh, really?
This was, yeah, I had hypertension to 230 systolic,
Okay. Wow.
and restless leg, narcolepsy, a number of other symptoms.
Was was
Of
that was
course, the
that why
tinnitus.
you were like starting to question the new
No,
vaccines, or?
I had been so actually. Somebody pointed out the other day. I had written a paper with Daryl Rickey that's only available on preprint servers. We could never get it published.
Okay.
Back in January of 2020, in which we had warned about the history of coronavirus vaccine development and the risk of antibody-dependent enhancement and other effects, in which this was part of the justification for why I focused on drug repurposing and got my team to focus on that beginning in January 2020.
Please explain what you antibody enhancement. Please explain that.
So there's a number of different mechanisms by which vaccines can actually paradoxically enhance disease.
Okay.
And uh, um, one of them is by this phenomena of immune imprinting or original antigenic sin. That is absolutely happening in the case of these coronavirus vaccines, and particularly with the boosters. That's well documented from some of the top laboratories in the world. Of course, the press completely ignores that, as does the World
Hmm.
Health Organization. That's a process by which, and by the way, it's a major problem with influenza vaccines,
Hmm.
where this repeated administration of slight variations in antigens results in a situation where paradoxically the patient is less able to respond to the current strain because their immune system is biased by the prior strain.
Right.
So that's one form of this immuno.
So your immune system searches for a guy that is no longer there, for an enemy that is no longer
That's
there.
that's one way to put it. And then in the case of antibody-dependent enhancement, which famously was responsible for excess child mortality in the 60s in the development of a respiratory syncytial virus vaccine, RSV being something that affects children. And by the way, there's strong evidence that respiratory syncytial virus didn't circulate in the human population before the end of World War II, and that it emerged into the human population due to a lab leak, probably in Bethesda, Maryland, from a monkey colony. So RSV is an example of another lab leak virus that we've all had to deal with ever since. So in developing an RSV vaccine, this was a formalin inactivated product. Paradoxically, it was discovered that the children, because this is a killer of particularly neonates and premature children, it was discovered that the children that were inoculated with the product had a higher mortality than the ones that had not received the product. So that's a type of disease enhancement.
Right.
And disease enhancement in general is the most frightening thing in the world of vaccinology, that you would administer a product and actually result in a higher probability of your patient becoming sick or dying.
Because there have been, as you said, there have been several papers out. I mean, there was one, I think about a year ago from Denmark, and now recently someone sent me this paper from Ohio, a preprint, also documenting that there is an association with how many shots or injections you have taken, and and the probability of catching the disease.
Right, exactly. So
have you seen that?
I have. I've
yeah.
seen those data, and they're quite compelling. But they're just more data on top of what we've been seeing globally for quite a while. Getting back to antibody-dependent enhancement, that was something that the FDA was specifically concerned about with the initial rollout, and they asked that the pharmaceutical companies assess and do tests to determine whether or not that was happening, but they didn't mandate it. And so therefore, those tests were not done. Those studies were not done. Right. That's the general guidance in the pharmaceutical industry. You don't do anything unless you're forced to do it. And this is the problem with the compromise of our regulatory bodies, is they haven't done their job, and there's this dynamic tension that has to exist between regulators and the pharmaceutical industry. It's just the way things have. Pharma doesn't do things because that's what they should do. They only do things because that's what they're forced to do. And it's a business model issue for pharma in terms of if they do a study, if they do science, they might discover something that would compromise the product. And so the general guidance is you never do things unless you're forced to do them. So that's just good to know. In the case of antibody-dependent enhancement, in general, a virus will broadly. This is a complicated topic. It's a simple phrase to say, but in general, a virus will have certain receptors and therefore only infect certain types of cells. Right. And in the case of, for instance, dengue, which also has a problem with antibody-dependent enhancement with the dengue vaccines, you can have a situation wherein this is very well understood, even with natural dengue infection, which has these multiple variants, wherein one is infected with one variant and clears it, the patient does, and typically does not have severe disease. Then they can be infected by another immunologically related but distinct variant. And the pre-existing antibodies from the first infection won't be sufficient to protect against the disease. But what they will do is bind to the virus and enable it to infect a different cell type that it would normally infect, that being macrophage and monocytes. And
Right.
suddenly you have this whole different population of cells that happens to be migratory, it goes all over your body, that are able to be infected by the virus. And those cells will support replication. In the case of the coronaviruses, the current coronaviruses, they don't generally infect monocytes. Even if they are antibody coded, from non-neutralizing antibodies, which is what occurs in the case of antibody-dependent enhancement, is that a virus gets infected by or coated with antibodies that will not block its ability to infect, but can potentially enable other cell types to become infected. In the case of monocytes with coronavirus, macrophage, white blood cells, these phagocytic cells, they don't seem to support replication of the virus even if it gets in. But there are other cells that apparently have Fc receptors or are able to be bridged so that you can get infection of new cell types in the presence of a non-neutralizing antibody in the case of these coronaviruses. And so that does happen now. There are papers out demonstrating that. Whether or not that's responsible for this clinical phenomena of enhanced risk of disease and death in the multiply jabbed that is dose dependent, so the more jabs, as you're observing, the more jabs, the higher probability. That it's unclear as to whether or not it's antibody-dependent enhancement versus immune imprinting,
Right.
versus
What about
immunosuppression.
exactly? What about immune fatigue? Because in my limited research, I should say, I came upon this with immune fatigue. For example, the early pneumococcal vaccine, I mean, not the current one, but the one that was administered to elderly people, when you gave it numerous times, the effect would go down. I mean, the effect of the vaccine would go
Right,
down.
and so that can
Yeah,
be due to a non-specific immunosuppression in the case of these mRNA products. That appears because spike as an antigen has biologic activity, which is
right.
basically immunotoxic. Um, but it can also be antigen specific in the case of the pneumococcal or other vaccines. So that relates more to this immune imprinting phenomena.
Uh-huh.
Um, uh, uh, and then there's this new category that's just recently popping up where, as you'll recall, since you're a vaccinologist back then, we have these different classes of antibodies, and we have we talk about antibody switching from IgM to IgG, but there's also switching among different IgG types, and
Right.
they have different
Exactly.
functions. And it seems that with the multiple inoculations, there are data out there suggesting that you move towards an antibody phenotype that is not typically associated with protection. IG4
Uh-huh.
types. So there's these multiple overlapping phenomena
Yeah.
of mechanisms for reduced effectiveness of these products. But what matters as clinicians, I think, is whatever the mechanism. And as far as I'm concerned, the mechanistic studies here are not yet conclusive, although the immune imprinting data are quite compelling. But these other phenomena are still earlier in assessment. But what matters as a clinician is that the finding of dose-dependent increased risk of hospitalization and death as endpoints,
Mm-hmm.
that's reproducible. and it's reproducible globally. And as I said, it's dose dependent. And it also, if you look at the timelines, and this is really informs some of the public policy statements that are being made that are a bit duplicitous because they're not revealing to us why they make these statements, but the data are there. And that is that if you follow the timeline, so
Right.
follow over time, protection post inoculation, you observe that with these, for instance, boosters, they use the term, and as far as I'm concerned, all of these inoculations are boosters because we have strong pre-existing coronavirus, both B and T responses from the circulating cold coronaviruses that cross-react with this SARS-CoV-2. So as far as I'm concerned, they're all boosters. But with this bivalent product that's being administered, you typically see a short-term bump in efficacy in terms of the outcomes of hospitalization and death, and then it declines on a fairly linear slope, and it crosses zero efficacy at about 2 months after inoculation,
Right.
and then it continues. That slope continues, and you move into negative efficacy or effectiveness territory after 2 months. And so this gets to the point that's often made by public health officials. You should have your booster every 2 months or every 3 months or whatever. That's because of this phenomena where you're getting a short-term pop in relatively non-specific, non-protective antibody titer, but you're getting a lot of it. And people don't think very much about antibodies, but it's quite complex. Over.
Yeah. Can I just jump in there? Because, as you say, this short window of protection, which could be a couple of months, which is seen in multiple studies, by the way. There was one famous from northern Sweden, which was highly transmitted over the social media, but that also showed this. But can there be, I mean, because I've looked into, or my group, I should say, the Doctors' Appeal of Sweden, we have looked, we have paid for and requested data that was not visible for the public from our health authority. And during 2021, there was more than 4,000 deaths labeled COVID. Now, they were grouped into two groups, unvaccinated and vaccinated. And we were able to find the exact because the unvaccinated group was blurred. So they had people who had one jab and two jabs, and then 2 weeks before they were counted as vaccinated.
Right.
So there were over 900 deaths that had been labeled as unvaccinated, but in fact had 1 or 2 jabs. And there seemed in our data to be an accumulation of deaths just like a week after the first jab, for example, or 2 weeks after the first jab. So that really was kind of shocking to me, because that's a misrepresentation of the data. You can't, if I was a professor and I had a student,
it appears to show bias in the public health officials. It's either bias or incompetence,
right.
And it's hard to differentiate. There, you may be familiar with the data of Theo Shooters, also from the Netherlands.
Sorry, I'm not. No.
Okay, so you can find that on our Substack essays, and Theo, of course, has been highly censored. He's a highly qualified vaccinologist, immunologist from the Netherlands. Yeah, as you know, those states, including the Netherlands and Sweden, have a long history of excellence in immunology and virology. Right. So Theo is a product of that system. And like you and your group, he has gone in and accessed multiple databases from the government and then collated and correlated those. And in his case, he's particularly focused on the vaccine campaigns in the elderly, which are performed in a very harmonized way in the Netherlands. They have those capabilities like in Sweden. They have a highly developed social medicine system and good record keeping. So they will decide that it's time to revaccinate their elders. I think it's 62 and above. And all that will transpire within a couple of weeks. So they have a very clean surge of vaccination. And then in his case, he brought from a different database all-cause mortality in that same cohort, just as you're alluding to. And then did the calculations to disambiguate all-cause mortality so that it was excess all-cause mortality. That turns out to be a little more complicated than you would think just from saying it. And then looked at that over time because they did repeated vaccination campaigns in the elderly cohort. And in fact, they show precisely, Theo does, what you're implying you're seeing in your data, but almost as if it was a structured rechallenge experiment, as you know, is one way to verify a cause-effect relationship in pharmaceuticals. So you see these waves of vaccination in the elderly cohort, and then you see a following wave of excess all-cause mortality in that same cohort that has an offset of something like a week to 2 weeks.
Right.
So repeated spikes in each variable. And of course, he's submitted that to his government, which is basically refusing to address the data. But you may wish to look for that, and he would be even a good person. I recommend for you to reach out to. It sounds like you're performing similar analyses with a similar focus, and you have the geography going in your favor. So so I recommend that you
I might do that.
try to connect with Theo.
But I mean, because when I present these, I mean, there are so many questions about. We haven't got time to get into all of them, of course. But I mean, natural immunity is another one, and giving these jabs to children is another one. And when I present these questions to my senior professors, infectious disease specialists, highly qualified people. I mean, CVs that goes a mile wide, long, right? And then they kind of like, yeah, but our government tries its best, and what if we didn't do it, and maybe so many people would die, and say, but you're like, you're not answering my question. You're not doing what you're supposed to do here with these clinical trials. You're not, and you're not doing what you're supposed to do with children. The children doesn't get sick. They don't die from this disease. So why expose them to an extra risk? And like the same thing with natural immunity. And like, why would you even consider giving a vaccine, let alone 2 shots or 3 shots, to a person who has already got the antibodies, already got the immunity from a natural infection? Like, why would you even consider it? You don't do that with chicken pox,
well,
or
this is the beauty. This is the beauty of the data on immune imprinting, is that it's quite clear and comprehensive that this practice of re-administering a very tuned monospecific antigen vaccine on top of the broad-based immunity obtained from natural infection and recovery actually reduces the effectiveness of the patient's immune system in resisting a follow-on infection.
That's very scary.
But it's the data are the data, right?
Yeah.
We're supposed to be data-based. That was the logic of evidence-based medicine. But what we have all observed is the profound power of this amazing, harmonized global propaganda campaign.
Right.
And I recommend for your consideration, if you're going to be operating in this area as you are, in being a truth teller, uh, in witnessing, being a witness to what has transpired here, and the compromise of medical and regulatory norms that has transpired. Uh, it is really helpful to spend some time learning about fifth generation warfare. What we've all received is military grade psychological operations propaganda deployed globally in the West, in the most profound, comprehensive propaganda campaign that's ever been done. I mean, the all across the world, for instance, influencers and artists were paid right at the outset to spread this propaganda of safe and effective. They were spreading the propaganda of safe and effective before they knew that what the actual data were. And we discuss this in the book. There was a study at Yale University, 600 persons, randomized prospective clinical trial, 6-month follow-up to clinically test various messaging campaigns and messages for their effectiveness in compelling people to accept the product, and furthermore to act to compel one's peers to accept the product. So all of us have been subjected to a massive, highly coordinated, prospectively planned propaganda campaign, the likes of which none of us have ever experienced before. And whether you mention Matthias Desmet, and here in the States, there's a number of haters that hate Matthias because they think, and by extension, they hate me, because they make the case that his theories of mass formation somehow attribute blame for what has transpired in terms of the hypnosis that people have experienced. They blame, the thesis is that Matthias is blaming the average person rather than those that have propagated this massive propaganda campaign. It's an absolute false reading of his work and his theories, and it's been propagated by people in your discipline that have their own books and their own interests that they're trying to pursue. So they basically use the same wording, but they rephrase it and then they take credit for it. Right. But there's no question that, the history of the term mass psychosis
right.
is long.
It's not new. I mean, that's part of our cultural heritage, right? I mean, what happened in Germany? Everybody goes like, yeah, mass psychosis. But I mean, what I think what maybe Desmet and by extension you do, that you have tried to explain what so many of us have experienced, that why are people just not listening to facts? Why are people kind of like shouting at people that they don't know, that they're stupid, that they're ignorant, that they're anti-vaxxer, that they should, that they should almost like they should die, that if you get to the hospital,
people have said that,
yeah,
right? People have said that. And this mass psychosis or hypnosis has penetrated the medical community to such an extent that we have these aberrant behaviors of unwillingness to provide transplant surgery or other procedures, or in the case of there's 2 cases now of infants with cardiac defects that the parents didn't wish them to receive blood from vaccine recipients that had spike protein in the blood. And there was the New Zealand case in which the child was taken away from the parents, even though they had banked spike negative blood for the transfusions of the infant. And there's a case in the United States where that was a similar situation was done. The hospital insisted on administering the blood that had the spike protein in it, and the child developed a massive clot, one-sided clot that, as I recall, reached from deep in the pelvis and leg through the arm,
Right.
and the child died. So we're the thing that I find most helpful about Matthias's theories, and by extension Hannah Arendt's theories and Jus Mallore's theories, etc., is that that logic that our patients, our peers, have been subjected to this intentional, massive, coordinated, highly refined propaganda technology, is that it allows us to forgive them. And I'm not in any way implying that we should forgive those that have perpetrated this on us. And we could name names there, but I don't think it's kind of out of scope for what we're talking about here. And it doesn't really help at the retail level of giving comfort and to your patients that are afflicted by the cognitive dissonance of living in a world in which their siblings won't talk to them, they're gaslit in their business or work environments, they're subjected to all of this derision, etc. And it makes people angry, I think, for good reason. I mean, I've had plenty of reason to be angry. You probably had plenty of reason to be angry, but we're adults and we've been trained to not react in a primitive way. But your patients generally have not had that level of training about defense mechanisms and other things, and they're justifiably angry, many of them, and often many people veer towards this language of we have to get the guillotine running again, or set up scaffolds and hang them, and all this, Nuremberg 2.0, and it's just not helpful. It just further divides the society. It tears us apart, and a case can be made that there may be those who profit by fragmenting the culture, and that makes it even easier for them to advance various agendas that they may have, financially, power, or otherwise. And I've been trying to, particularly this season in my travel to Austria last week, in the podcast that I've been giving, and in the title of the book, The Better Future Coming, trying so hard to help heal to the extent that I can. And what I've experienced is that when I share, before all this noise happened in the United States that makes it so that I can't even talk about mass formation anymore. But back before all of this attack started happening on Matthias, when I would share the logic and theories, I would see relief on people's face. I would see tears streaming down their face. It suddenly gave people a way to forgive their close contacts.
Right, that had been persecuting them or calling them names or whatever.
Yeah, and now we have, for instance, this Hollywood celebrity, Tim Robbins, that you may not know about in Sweden, but he's a high-profile, we call it the term progressive in California, in the Hollywood community, which has been that community has been all in with the jab and promoting the jab. Of course, they all got paid highly for it by our government right at the outset. But so there's a financial conflict of interest. But in any case, Tim Robbins, who had been one of those speaking out and saying these very egregious tribal things, is now apparently seeking some sort of absolution or redemption by recanting his prior behavior.
What has he
And we,
said specifically now, recently? I haven't followed.
so he said things like, basically he said we all went crazy. Uh,
Right.
and he's referred to the tribalism that took place,
Mm.
uh, and expressed his regret for these kinds of statements that you were just citing, that people should be. I don't know if he made the um, uh, some of those statements about that people should be killed or they should be placed into.
Not receiving healthcare was one common. If you're
Yeah,
if you haven't
right.
taken the vaccine, you go to the hospital. You shouldn't you shouldn't receive healthcare, or you should pay for it. Like you shouldn't get it for within your tax benefits or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
And so these kind of things, or even like you should be. I even heard something like you shouldn't be buried in the same place. I mean, there's a whole list of things that people have said.
Yeah, and we had so we have a scientist here in the United States that there's people are how people try to campaign for the Nobel Prize, uh, and in Sweden, I'm sure you've experienced this from time to time,
Yeah.
and they mount these press marketing campaigns, and there's one in progress right now for Dr. Peter Hotez, as you may know. Uh,
Right.
that's being promoted by the World Health Organization. But Mr. Hotez has made statements to the effect that anyone who criticizes Tony Fauci should be arrested. Um, I mean, he's all in on uh, um, authoritarian responses,
Right.
which is really what we're talking about, over-the-top authoritarian responses that aren't
Yeah.
justified by the science.
I have two questions for you before we end. I know you have to go real soon. Um, for just how important, I mean, for Sweden in 2020 was a country that didn't follow the normal algorithm. You know about this.
I
We ne we,
know.
yeah.
So you're. That's why I'm so. Yeah. So it's been fascinating watching and listening to the attacks on Sweden.
Right.
Um,
And what our attackers have kind of humbled now, because we had no
yes,
lockdown.
the
We had
data.
no masking. We had all
Yes.
schools open. I'm so grateful, actually. I'm very grateful to my Anders Tegnell, our chief epidemiologist, who kept the schools open. I have children myself, and it's hard. I mean, to be, yeah, subjugated to a lockdown in a small apartment with children. It's
That's
horrible for the children.
somebody that should be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize
Exactly. Yeah, for his for for
for
his
having
work in
courage.
for exactly for having the courage in 2020 to stand up against everybody,
Yes.
virtually everybody. Also, very many internal in Sweden. I mean, the journalists and also lawyers were begging him to lock them in, and he wouldn't do it. He said, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to follow the data. There is no reason why I should lock you down." And
Yeah.
they wanted to get locked down.
Yes.
Uh,
Well, that is fascinating in and of itself, isn't it?
yeah.
That govern me harder, daddy. Can I have
Yeah.
another jab kind of logic?
Right. And Sweden. So how helpful was the example of Sweden? Because I know that you're not, I mean, you're one of very high profile, but you're not alone. You have mentioned several others and very high profile doctors, physicians. So you have kind of like I suppose peer support, right? But how important was the example of Sweden for you in 2020 and still? Because we never had a lockdown, we never wore masks. I mean,
So
and
there's
still we have the
basically
least excess deaths
in the
in
global
Europe. Yeah,
data, there are a couple of standout um, uh, control groups. Is really what
exactly.
it is. Um, and Sweden became kind of a little bit mixed, because although you didn't have these authoritarian practices, there still was some strong encouragement of
Right.
vaccine uptake, and there was significant vaccine acceptance. So it's not a pure control, um, but Sweden had the benefit of your public health system with the record keeping that you have, and Sweden and Iceland, as I recall, were both among the most reliable databases in a landscape where data was highly selectively reported, is the gentlest word I could use. And so we had those kind of Northern European exceptions that could be cited in contrast to the dominant approved narrative. And then we had the natural experiments of much of the emerging economies, particularly in Africa, where these were also highly under-vaccinated, and to the extent even that South Africa was vaccinated, quote unquote, that let's say vaccine cards were readily obtained for a very nominal fee without having received the vaccine. And so that practice of having the appearance of compliance without actually accepting the product was widespread in South Africa. And so the divergence in the mortality between Western world and Sweden to some extent and the emerging economies that were highly under-vaccinated is profound. One of the problems is that in all of these data is this confounding of assigning causation when you have correlation in terms of the diagnosis. So if one has a the PCR assay clearly over represented the actual virus presence in the population. And this was known at the very outset that this was going to be the case. The Chinese knew it. It was a major problem for them because if you have had any virus replication, that polynucleotide persists for a long period of time. Right. But there was this policy, I think, put in place in the United States, certainly, for financial reasons to support the hospitals that were told they could no longer do elective procedures of attributing any hospitalization or death with the PCR positive test as a hospitalization or death due to the virus. As somebody trained in pathology, this has been a madness as far as I'm concerned, all the way through. But the consequence is that, and I think we have to be honest with ourselves, those data indicating, for instance, the United States has one of the highest mortality rates in the world. That's all feels good. It's confirmatory if you believe, if you're like myself, that believe that the vaccines have significant morbidity and mortality associated with them. But you have to be honest with yourself and acknowledge that those mortality data are contaminated because of this over-reporting problem. But that's the importance now. We're finally getting to where we can derive these correlations, particularly with all-cause mortality in medical databases such as you have in the Scandinavian countries, as well as the actuarial insurance databases from all over the world, Germany and the United States in particular, that are clearly demonstrating this paradoxical increase in all-cause mortality in highly vaccinated populations, that even year on year, comparing to 2020, for instance, when we had what ostensibly is a more lethal or a more highly pathogenic virus circulating, and yet we don't observe the more excess all-cause mortality. And then once the vaccines are deployed, we do see that excess all-cause mortality.
And also in populations that are younger, working age.
Precisely. Yep. That the very ones that were subject to the mandates. Yeah. So now we're in a situation where the data are increasingly overt, undeniable, and those that one would think would in a rational world would accept that they have misrepresented the safety and effectiveness of the vaccine products. One would think they would say in a rational world, oh, we got it wrong. We should stop these behaviors. We should stop this messaging. We should stop this propaganda. And instead, they're doubling down and increasing it, and clearly in denial. And because they are able to control so much of the information spectrum, they are able to warp reality. That's my point about this propaganda campaign.
Exactly. And I was gonna, my ultimate question was about the propaganda campaign. And I mean, how much of this, according to you and all the evidence that you have gathered in your book and in your search for the truth, how much of this was, I mean, the pandemic was pre-planned, and how much was like controlled from various international bodies like the WHO and the WEF? Because I know, for example, in the European Union, there was a plan to roll out digital vaccine passports that was officially made by the EU Commission in 2018 or 19, I think, well before the pandemic. There was this plan to that, but there was, of course, no mention of COVID. But the plan, and you can find it online still, the plan was there before the pandemic, to have this kind of surveillance of people's private. How much of the,
my opinion is, so let's try to stay within the boundaries of things that we can absolutely document, because there's plenty of that. We don't have to get into speculation about the Illuminati, for example.
Please don't.
Okay, or the Rothschilds, or any of those things. We don't have to go there. We have plenty of documentation about clear, explicit, tangible practices, procedures, policies, as you say. And then it's being augmented by, for instance, the Twitter files drops and the testimony in the European Parliament from the Pfizer vice president, et cetera. Those, in addition to the long history of planning, and to give the devil his due, war game planning for infectious disease outbreaks is an appropriate activity, in my opinion, of public health. What else would we do? Of course we would plan if we're responsible public servants. The devil's in the details. Event 201, which was funded by the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, in I don't think anybody can deny that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Bill Gates has a financial conflict of interest in this, consequent to his investments in the vaccine industry.
Right.
That's just, it's clearly documented. He has a financial conflict of interest. He is not a physician. He should not be setting public health policy, and yet he has applied his skills as a monopolist, which are highly developed, to basically monopolize public health policy globally. That's honest truth. It's incontrovertible. Bill Gates has grossly disproportionate influence on setting global public health policy, and he's unqualified to do so. And he has made a series of decisions based on his own personal bias that have adversely impacted on global health and perverted the World Health Organization, as far as I'm concerned. Event 201, held in a facility at Johns Hopkins University that's notorious for being very tightly allied with the CIA. And by the way, that's one of the things that's coming out of the Twitter files now, is that it wasn't just the FBI. The CIA was deeply involved in all of this censorship, information control, and propaganda. And if it was doing this in the United States, I don't see how it wasn't doing it globally. That's just hard to imagine.
Right.
So we absolutely have clear documentation about the planning to deploy a massive propaganda campaign, which it precisely parallels that which was deployed, and involved this sophisticated integration of all global media. That one of the vehicles for that was the Trusted News Initiative, managed by the BBC, and a lot of evidence managed by British intelligence. We see this in the form
And
of
what was the Trusted News Initiative? What was its purpose?
the ostensible original purpose for Trusted News Initiative was to create a structure to prevent incursion and of foreign actors in the inciting event, ostensibly was Russia, in impacting on democratic elections.
Right.
In worldwide, United States, UK, elsewhere. And the Trusted News Initiative, of which Twitter is a central partner still, is basically a trade organization of all major corporate and social media globally. AFP, everything
Reuters.
is Reuters. They're all tied together through TNI, and it's fascinating to dive into the documents around that. The assertion is that originally that we needed to resist Russian propaganda and infiltration through social media, etc. But then that was in 2019 transformed into an initiative also to resist vaccine mis and disinformation.
Already in 2019.
Yes.
Wow.
Okay. And so, before the outbreak. So this is more evidence of coordination and the logic and structures of the TNI and the deployed propaganda were absolutely at the center of the planning in Event 201.
Right. And do you feel, or do you think that, I mean, there's lots of evidence, even now, in the mainstream media have published some of it, that there was a lab leak from Wuhan, China, that was a lab that was financed by
Well, the Lancet Commission,
by U.S. Bodies. And do you think that, I mean, what do we know as so far as it was an accident? I mean, a leak of a lethal virus that they had constructed immorally and unethically, according to me, but that leaked from the lab, or what's your take on that?
so having worked at animal research and at the California Primate Research Colony in Davis, and being a primate research colony investigator, and my wife has worked in primatology at zoos, etc., for years. She worked at two of the top zoos in the United States, San Diego Zoo and the Brookfield Zoo in Chicago, in primates. We're both very aware by training and practice that non-human primates always are associated with the risk of transmission, and also that's the case with increasingly these humanized mouse models that incorporate, through a variety of technologies, aspects of the human immune system or other phenotypes that might be used to support a virus. And there's no question that in addition to the engineering of the virus, which took place at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, as you correctly note, with funding from both agency in the United States, So that's US DoD. That's not DARPA. That's DITRA. And it's the DITRA threat mitigation branch, the same people that bought up the loose nukes in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so they have justified their funding of the Wuhan Institute of Virology with the logic that somehow they're supporting Chinese scientists like the Bat Lady that might otherwise go rogue and go work for the bad guys, whoever those are, as if the CCP is not the bad guys. It's a grossly naive, but there's I think the conclusion of the Lancet Commission, and I think most objective observers, is that the virus was engineered, and there's multiple footprints of that, including the furin cleavage site. Right. How the virus got out of the lab, or whether the virus that entered the population in China was actually from that lab or from some other lab. So there's a whole cluster of questions around when the virus entered the human population, when it was in circulation in North America, for example. There's archived blood bank serum data suggesting that it was much earlier in 2019 than is officially acknowledged. And whether this odd paradox that the virus, we were told that it was from bats or pangolins being sold in the Wuhan seafood market as live food. That really doesn't, that's not consistent with the data, let's say. That's right. My story about being very aware of the nature of primate research and animal research colonies and the risks to technicians, is to say that in my experience, it's entirely plausible that there was an accidental transmission to technicians or others that then served as a bridge to allow the virus to enter the general population in Wuhan. There's this odd paradoxical observation of this gentleman, Michael Callahan, who is the leading U.S. Specialist, a CIA agent or former CIA agent, who is the leading U.S. specialist in gain of function research from a funding and oversight management perspective. Absolutely a former DARPA project manager in this area, who was in Wuhan very early on in 2019, if not, in 2020, if not in 2019, which our government denies was the case, but I know because he called me that he was, that I'm still troubled by the coincidence that this virus entered the population in China in literally the beating industrial heart of the nation. That doesn't make, that's odd. But why would China want to place the Wuhan Institute of Virology in Wuhan? That's akin to the U.S. government putting in high containment research laboratories in Boston, which in fact they have done. So that's just bad policy. There is also this very odd paradox that this highly this RNA respiratory virus, which is prone to a very high rate of mutation, somehow simultaneously popped up all over the world with virtually the identical genetic sequence. That shouldn't happen. If it was a single point of entry into the general population, the sequence observed initially should be very different from the sequence that was then detected in, say, Italy or Sweden or the United States. Why? It's very hard to explain that molecular virology. It just doesn't make sense.
The
And
geographic distances and the people
and
that they had
and the
traveled
preservation
through.
of the sequence just doesn't make
Yeah.
sense. Um,
Which
so
would imply that, according to you, maybe that it was spread earlier,
no,
or
it's still earlier spread does not. If it was a single point of entry into the population,
right,
it would have evolved by the time
right,
it made it to Europe, um, uh, let alone North America. Uh, it is very hard to square the circle of the generation time and generation cycle and the apparent maintenance of a fairly homogeneous, harmonized sequence initially, and then we've all seen the divergence of the sequence subsequently. Um, so there are various theories about that that I don't want to go into, but I think anybody who's responsibly thinking about this and trying to comprehend what has transpired has to account for this very odd phenomena of
yeah,
harmonized global distribution of a sequence. Um, and that's a hard one to account for. Uh, why? Um, so there's no way that I can discern, in hence I have no official opinion
right,
on whether um, this virus was deployed or
right,
inadvertently entered the population. But I think the data and evidence trail uh, is fairly strong that it was human engineered. And I mean, there's just a whole lot of things here. If you examine, as they say, follow the money. If you examine the interests of the various parties,
right,
um, uh, I'm still bothered by the very vocal statements um, by the Trump administration that this is a Chinese virus. They just Chinese, Chinese, Chinese. They
yeah,
kept saying this, and that sounds like propaganda to me. And then why would they be doing that? There's just a bunch of things here in terms of the origin of this. And then we have Ferguson and the London people grossly overestimating
yeah. From the Imperial College, that
the
yeah,
morbidity
says
and
Sweden will
mortality.
have 60,000 deaths if we don't lock down, and in fact we had maybe a tenth of that. So in
Yeah.
2020, yeah,
And then he's come out with this recent paper that was published in peer reviewed, I think it was Lancet, that we've saved this a very large number of deaths in the United States. Was it 30 million or something by the
hmm
vaccine? And his logic is so tortured. Basically, uh, to put my own version of it, um, uh, I, as if I'm Ferguson, I grossly overestimated the mortality risk. Um, and now I have evaluated the outcome, and it's much less than what I predicted.
right,
Therefore, that difference must be due to the vaccine. I mean,
right.
the logic here is,
It's mind blowing.
yeah, and the fact that this junk would be published in the Lancet uh, speaks to an agenda other than scientific objectivity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have been more than generous with your time, Dr. Malone. It's been an honor and a pleasure to speak with you. Of course, I have so many more questions I would ask, but time doesn't allow that. And I really recommend people to get your book. It's broadly available. I got it on an application called Next Story in Sweden. I have it on my mobile phone. I'm on the last chapters now. I really, really
Oh,
recommend people to to get it and to dive into the facts. It's a fact-based book. It's a fact-driven person that has written it, and or persons, sorry.
thank you.
Yeah. So just thank you and hope to speak to you sometime again.
Thank you. Thank you for the time and for the opportunity to speak to your listeners.
Right.